So I want to finish talking about the scientific method or methods today. We've talked about how it can involve hypothesis testing, whether through modeling or observation or experiment. We talked on Friday about what a formal experiment really involves. So we talked about control groups and things like that. But there's lots of things that humans do that aren't science. And the most basic definition is that a statement that you cannot put to some sort of test is not scientific and doesn't have any place in science. That doesn't mean that statements that can't be tested scientifically are useless or stupid or meaningless or wrong. It's just that with statements like those, the scientific toolkit doesn't work. That's why you need to take more than just science classes. That's why we have you taking philosophy and things like that, to think about other ways of thinking. But not every problem that humans might face can be solved with the scientific method, just like not every carpentry problem can be solved with a circular saw. And a statement that can never be falsified isn't science. Anything to be scientific, it has to be at least theoretically possible that some kind of evidence could turn up that would falsify it, that would force us to drop it. Even things as universally accepted as like gravity, right? Things falling down when you drop them. That's been tested over and over and over again. It's used in everything from, I don't know, estimating, the flight of golf balls to the flight of ballistic missiles. We use it all the time, but it's still at least possible that we could discover some kind of principle that we don't know about, do some sort of experiment that nobody's thought of before, that would either disprove gravity as we understand it, or at least force us to modify it quite a bit. It's not very likely, but it still could happen. Everything that I'm teaching in this course could someday turn out to be wrong. Remember that if you remember nothing else. I don't think it's likely to be. All of this stuff that I'm going to be talking about has been tested very well, and I'm going to try to show you what the tests are, how these have been tested. But we always have to be open to the possibility that what we thought we knew might have to be replaced. We always have to remember that our understanding is always going to be limited. And so a statement that can never, by any evidence possible, be proved wrong does not count as science. And a lot of conspiracy theories fail to be scientific in this regard. Okay, we've been making experiments and doing observations on the shape of the Earth ever since the days of the ancient Greeks. They worked out, especially a guy named Eratosthenes, not only that the Earth was more or less a sphere or close to it, but how big it was. A guy named Eratosthenes measured the size of the Earth using some very simple math and some fairly simple observations. And so we've tested that quite thoroughly. If you talk to one of the folks who are seriously into the flat Earth, saying that the Earth is flat is not unscientific, because you could test it. You could do what Eratosthenes did and measure the length of shadows at different latitudes. You could launch satellites and take pictures. You could test it lots of different ways. If you're arguing with a flat earther, they'll tell you, that when ships appear to disappear over the curvature of the horizon, it's really just the atmosphere bending the light. And then if you ask them about satellite pictures, they'll tell you they're all faked. And if you ask them, how it's possible to fly from South America to Australia, which you can do on a globe, but would be too far if the Earth is flat, they'll tell you that Australia doesn't exist and it's all a hoax done by NASA. Every evidence you could possibly give them is either going to be reinterpreted or dismissed as part of some giant conspiracy to fool everybody as to what the truth is. And if you're dealing with that, you are no longer dealing with science. Someone who believes that every evidence is just part of a vast conspiracy is not dealing in science anymore. I can tell you what evidence I would have to see to reject the idea that the Earth is round. A seriously committed flat earther, for a person like that, there is no evidence you could possibly give them. And once you're at that point, you're no longer doing science. You're no longer operating in a scientific framework, and arguing basically becomes pointless as far as I'm concerned. I mean, especially because the Earth is really shaped like a giant burrito. Actually, I'm kidding. It's not. It's more or less round. Right. So what are some things that aren't science? One is aesthetics. Aesthetics is the field of philosophy that tries to look at not truth, but beauty. What are some, what makes something beautiful? What I said it, so it's, what did I say? That's okay. The Earth is not actually shaped like a burrito, dude. I promise you, it's not.
It's shaped like a toaster.
Aaron, shut up. Sorry, my kid just woke up and told me the Earth is shaped like a toaster. If it's on the internet, it must be true. The burrito Earth theory. Oh God, what have I done? All right, I better not be seeing Facebook groups dedicated to the burrito Earth. Like, just don't. Toaster Earth. All right, shut up about the shape of the Earth. Look, aesthetics. That's the field of philosophy that deals with beauty. So a statement of aesthetics would be something like Beethoven's Seventh Symphony is more beautiful than Brahms's First Symphony. Or the music of Taylor Swift is more beautiful than the music of Miley Cyrus, or something like that. It's not wrong to think about things like this. It's certainly not wrong to have an interest for beauty. Okay, nature can give us a model of harmony and composition that might be interpreted as beauty. Yes, but is that beauty in nature, or is it entirely in our heads? And if we change our minds, we might not see it as beautiful anymore. That's getting into philosophy, and that's not really my bailiwick. But it turns out to be really, really hard to pin down exactly what we mean by beauty. I mean, we can test popularity. We could test and see who's sold more records, Taylor Swift or Miley Cyrus, or Brahms versus Beethoven, but that's not quite the same thing. And again, it's not bad thinking about qualities of beauty, but it's not the sort of thing you can subject to a formal experiment. You could experiment on which is more popular. I could play both
Surveys.
Taylor Swift and Miley Cyrus and ask you, what percentage of the class liked one over the other. But there's plenty of music out there that some people consider very beautiful, but it's never been very popular. I know people who will rhapsodize about the most beautiful death metal they've ever heard. Most people that listen to death metal don't find it beautiful at all. Yeah, beauty is subjective. Can't we define the characteristics and then it would be scientific? Yeah, who's going to define the characteristics? I would argue that you can't use the scientific method to define what you mean by beauty. And I want to keep going. We could keep discussing the point, and you're certainly not wrong to bring it up. And it's not that talking about beauty is a waste of time. It's just not the kind of thing that the scientific method can ultimately deal with unless you kind of arbitrarily decide what beautiful is before you begin. Statements that aren't precise are often not science, or at least not very good science, because if you're going to state a hypothesis, you have to define exactly what you mean. So if my hypothesis is when the sun shines on plants, stuff happens. Okay, what do you mean by stuff? You've got to be more specific about what you mean by stuff if you want your hypothesis to be taken seriously. And this is why science uses math in many branches. We're not going to go too ham on the math in this course, but certainly fields like physics use very heavy math quite a lot. And the reason why it does is not because physics professors are evil sadists, although sometimes they are. It's because math forces you to be very precise about exactly what you mean. And the same thing is true for all the words that we're going to get. I promise you, I try to soft pedal the vocabulary, but there's a lot of words in here that you may not already know. And learning them can be a colossal pain in the neck. But the reason they're useful is that they've got very precise meanings. And they enable us to talk about hypotheses in a rigorous way. It's the same reason that car mechanics have a lot of specialized vocabulary. It's the reason why when you take your car to a mechanic, they'll tell you, well, the fuel injectors are clogged, instead of, well, stuff is happening somewhere, right? You don't want to go to a mechanic that just tells you that stuff is happening somewhere and charges you $500 for it. You want to go somebody who can be precise about exactly what's going on under your hood. Science works the same way. This is a big one. Statements of morality, statements of what people should do. We can use the toolkit of science to explain why the world is the way it is. And we can use it to predict what will happen if you do certain things, but there is no logical way for it to tell you what you should do. You know, somebody like Anthony Fauci can tell you, okay, we have tested these vaccines. We have found that they are very safe and the risk of side effects is very small, much smaller than a lot of everyday things that you do anyway. We've tested how it works. We know what mRNA vaccines do and how they operate. You know, that's all stuff you can work with in the laboratory, as Fauci and thousands of other people do on a regular basis. The problem is there's always going to be people who have already decided that there are values that they hold that are more important than getting the vaccine. And purely in the realm of science, there's no way to argue them out of that. There's no logical way that you can get from what is the case to what you ought to do. And we sometimes call this the is-ought dichotomy, or the dichotomy between fact and value. And this is something that pops up a lot in all kinds of discussions. You know, we can tell you in great detail, you know, how a fertilized egg in a human uterus implants in the lining and develops from a little ball of cells to a hollow ball of cells to a little lump inside the hollow ball to a little lump with buds that grow into arms and legs and all of that. We can tell you what is. What we cannot tell you is whether you should or should not remove that bump of cells in the uterus under certain circumstances. You know, we can tell you the facts behind how babies grow in the uterus, we can't tell you whether a given person should or should not keep them there. That's just the way things go. A common mistake that people make in logic is called the naturalistic fallacy, and that's the logical error of asserting that something that is something that should be. You know, it's the saying that things like, you know, homosexuality is morally wrong because it is unnatural because it can't produce babies. Anytime somebody is arguing that such and such is unnatural, they're probably committing the naturalistic fallacy. I am naturally so extremely nearsighted, I'm basically legally blind without my glasses. There's no way to get from the fact that, you know, what I am is naturally nearsighted to the moral imperative that I should not wear glasses. You know, I think most of us would say that it is not necessarily morally wrong, you know, to correct your vision if it is, you know, naturally very blurry. You hear this mistake made an awful lot, but there's no logical way to get from what is to something that should or should not be. That whole realm of should is the realm of a completely different field. That's where moral and ethical philosophy come in. Okay, all right. I trust I've made that point fairly clear. Now the real Lulu, religious and spiritual statements, like Odin wants us to sacrifice our enemies whom we have defeated in battle, or Jesus saves people from their sins if they accept his redemptive death on the cross, and so on and so on. You hear a lot about some sort of battle between science and religion, and there are indeed some scientists who have come out in recent years as outspoken atheists. Probably the best known would be a guy named Richard Dawkins. Maybe some of you have read some of his writing. I'll tell you right now that this is not a requirement to be a scientist or to do good science. In the time that I've been here, I came to UCA in the fall of 1997, which means that I'm finally at the stage in my career when I can say, I've been teaching here for longer than you've been alive, right? Get off my lawn, kids these days, the millennials with their avocado toast. Anyway, right. In the time that I've been here, I've worked with a lot of people, fellow professors and also graduate students. And many of the people that I've worked with have gone on to other things. They're not all here right now. But I can tell you in the time that I've been here, I've known coworkers, you know, here at UCA, Harvard in the holler itself, who have been committed Christians of several denominations and, you know, really trying to walk the walk and practice their faith and live it as far as I can judge. We've had at least a couple of people who were raised in Hinduism, at least one guy who was Jewish, at least one guy who was a Sikh, several people who've been agnostic or atheist, and at least a couple of pagans in the mix. All of them, as far as I am able to judge, very sincere about their personal faith. And all of them pretty good scientists as far as I've ever had opportunity to observe. There are plenty of scientists who hold religious beliefs quite sincerely and try to follow them as best they can. I've seen it in, you know, just my career here. And if anybody was worried about that, I am never going to expect that any of you give up some item of religious faith in order to do well in this course. That is not what I am here to do. We are going to talk about some live wire issues that touch on religion, like evolution, for example. And I'm not out to take anybody's belief. If you believe in something that makes you a better human being, stick with it as far as I'm concerned. The problem comes when you try to use the rules of one field to play in the realm of the other. The problem comes when you try to, run a triple option play and pick up yardage in basketball, right? Doesn't actually work that well. And I want to give you a case study of why it doesn't work that well. All the way back in 1999, there were some researchers working at the Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, and they took 990 patients who were admitted to the coronary care unit. They were having heart attacks. Unbeknownst to the patients all got the same care. They're all at the same hospital. The doctors are all treating them as equally as possible. The patients that were selected for this study all had heart attacks of roughly the same severity. But unbeknownst to either the patients or their doctors, the researchers assigned each patient either to the experimental group or the control group. Now, the experimental and the control group were treated by the same doctors, given the same standard of care at the same hospital. The difference was that the names of the people in the experimental group, unbeknownst to them, were given to a local church's prayer team. Just a group of people in the church who volunteer to pray for whoever it is that they're prayed for. And the people on the prayer team prayed for these names. They didn't know anything about them but their names. And it turned out that the patients who had been prayed for had a better average outcome. They were less likely to die. They recovered faster. They spent fewer days in the hospital than the people who had not been prayed for. So can we conclude from this that prayer heals? The people who did this study had designed the experiment as well as they possibly could. I mean, they did everything right. It was double blind, so neither the patients nor their doctors knew who was being prayed for and who was not. The patients were all given as close to the same standard of care as you can reasonably expect. So the experiment was done about as well as you can. The experiment was not bad. The problem is that, first of all, any valid scientific finding has to be reproducible. If I do an experiment and I get a certain result, anybody else in the world who's got the same equipment and ability to use it ought to be able to do the same experiment and get the same result. And the problem was that follow-up studies did not confirm that intercessory prayer worked. The first experiment, there's always a chance that that result is just a fluke. It's just dumb luck that the patients who got assigned to the experimental group happened to have less severe heart attacks than the patients in the control group. So yeah, that one result that they got in the 1999 study seems to have been just dumb luck, because at least 17 different studies have been performed to follow up on this, and they don't get consistent results. Usually there hasn't been any difference. In one study, patients who were told they were being prayed for had worse complications than patients who didn't, possibly because of a kind of reverse placebo effect, right? If you go into the hospital for treatment for a heart attack and somebody tells you, wow, yeah, the whole prayer team at First Baptist Church of Texarkana is praying for you, that might not actually be that comforting. You might think, oh, good grief, I must be in terrible shape if they've called in the prayer warriors of First Baptist of Texarkana, that might be more scary than reassuring. And people who were told they were being prayed for actually turned out to have more complications. And again, that may be a reverse placebo effect. There's also the fact that if we're testing a drug, then everybody in the experimental group gets the same dose of the drug, and everybody in the control group doesn't get any drug. But how can you be sure that the control group is not being prayed for? You know, how do you calibrate the dosage of prayers? You really can't in the way that you would calibrate, you know, the dosage of a medicine, right? You can't measure prayer in milligrams or anything like that. You know, you can't put it into equally sized pills. And all you would have to do is pray for everybody, for one person to say, oh God, please bless everybody in the control group. And you've completely undermined the whole experiment. You can't stop the people in the control group from getting prayed for. So that's what makes experiments like this, I hesitate to say invalid. I don't think it's wrong that somebody tested this, but it makes it just about impossible that you're ever going to get really meaningful results out of a test like this. I'm never going to say that praying for somebody who's sick doesn't work, and I'm certainly not going to tell anybody not to do it. If it's a practice that gives you comfort, then go ahead by all means. But when you try to pin this down using the scientific method, first of all, the results aren't reproducible. Second of all, because you can't control the dosage of prayer, you know, you can never be sure that the control group is getting less prayer than the experimental group. It also raises some interesting religious questions as well, because if it works out, then, you know, the God that's being prayed to, that's healing these people, turns out to be a God that you can bribe. It turns out that God is saying, okay, this person is being prayed for by his loving family and the prayer warriors of First Baptist of Texarkana. I'll heal that person. This person's over here is only being prayed for by his loving family. He can go to hell. You know, it turns God into the sort of person that heals people on the basis of a popularity contest. I really don't want to go any farther with this, because what I'm not paid to do is speculate on the nature of God or gods and whether or not they answer prayer. That's something that you've all got to figure out on your own. My point is that blending science and faith and trying to test a faith-based idea using the scientific method might sound like a really good idea, but it not only turns out to be not good science, but it raises some uncomfortable religious questions as well. And again, this doesn't mean that you have to be an atheist or an agnostic to be a scientist. I've known plenty of scientists who believed in God or gods. Among most working scientists, religious belief seems to be roughly as common as it is in the general population. And it certainly doesn't mean that we don't feel amazement and wonder and awe at the universe and the things in it that we get to see. You know, we are not soulless robots just going through, you know, the motions in the lab where everything is reduced to just plain, you know, numbers and figures and things like that. But it does mean that when we're doing our work, we don't blend science with religion or with the supernatural. It's not that that's not valid, it's that that's not the place for it. No, I tend to hold to Stephen Jay Gould's philosophy of what he called non-overlapping magisteria, meaning that both religion and science have their own domains in human life. Both have their functions, both can enrich human life in various ways, but don't mix them, because the way that the rules that one play don't apply to the way that the other works. Okay, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Right, in the remaining 7 minutes that we've got, I may not finish all of this, but I'm going to boldly set forward anyway. Now that we've talked about what science is, since biology is the science of life, let's talk a bit about what life is. I know some people who work for NASA and that they've actually had to do some serious thinking about what if there is life on other bodies in the solar system or planets around other stars. How would we recognize it, and is it going to look familiar to us? I know that in Star Trek, all of these aliens are basically people with rubber things on their foreheads. But in reality, if there's life on other planets, it might look so different from what we're used to that we might not recognize it as such. And we're going to find some cases later on of entities like viruses, for example, which are not exactly living, but not exactly non-living either. You can find things that kind of straddle the boundary between living and not living. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So it's harder than you might think to come up with some definition of life that works in all cases and is never ambiguous. But I'll try anyway. All the life that we know is based on a common chemistry. Living things, or as we call them, organisms, are made up, about 96% of their mass is 4 chemical elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, which you can abbreviate CHON. As we will see later, we'll get into this in a bit, the elements phosphorus and sulfur are structurally very important in critical roles, even though they make up only about 2.5% of your mass. So the big 4 would be CHON: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. The next 2 would be the elements sulfur and phosphorus. And so the big 6 would be CHNOPS, if you want to use that as some kind of mnemonic. There's many other elements that do get used. You know, some of them you might take as supplements. If you take calcium or iron or zinc or magnesium or what have you, but they're not necessarily as universal and they're not nearly as abundant. The bulk of living chemistry is based on CHNOPS. And if you're wondering why, you can think of atoms of CHNOPS as being like basic Legos, right? If you buy a Lego building block set, you know, if you buy like a helicopter kit, some of the Legos in there aren't really useful for anything other than one specific thing, like the helicopter rotor. You can't really do anything with it other than stick it on top of the helicopter. But these little, you know, 6 dots and 8 dots and 4 dots and 2 dot basic Legos, which were pretty much all they had when I was a little kid, you have enough of those simple Legos and you stick enough of them together and you can freaking build the Statue of Liberty. You can put them together, you know, if you had a box full of Lego helicopter rotors, you can't do anything with that. Some chemical elements are like that in that they don't form a lot of bonds with each other. But Legos like these, the simple set, you got enough of those, you can build almost anything. You can build it almost indefinitely large. You could build a life-size house out of them if you really wanted to. And you can think of CHNOPS as being like that. We're not going to go too deep into the chemistry. We've got a perfectly good chemistry department if you want to know why this is the case. But those 6 elements bind with each other very easily, and they bind in ways that allows you to build very, very big structures out of them. And atoms of schnapps can be put together to make a ridiculously large number of sometimes very large and complicated assemblies called molecules. Living things take in energy and matter from the outside. In you get both your energy and your matter from food. Plants would get energy because they've got a neat trick to harvest sunlight. But regardless, living things use that energy and that matter in order to build up their own molecules, a process we call anabolism, and also break down molecules, a process we call catabolism. So anabolism, as in anabolic steroids, you build up. Breaking down large molecules is called catabolism, and the sum of both of those is called your metabolism. Every living thing's got a metabolism, got pathways, almost like assembly lines in a factory, by which they build up and break down their own molecules. And there's 4 major classes of big, complicated molecule that all living things have. Carbohydrates include sugars and starches and cellulose, which is the stuff that wood and paper are made of. Lipids includes fats and oils and waxes. Proteins do an awful lot of stuff. And we will talk about what those do in agonizing detail when we're a bit past halfway in the course. And finally, nucleic acids, which store information. And you'll be hearing a lot more about proteins and nucleic acids soon, but not today, because it is 10:50 and it's time for me to wind this down. So we'll pick up the rest on Wednesday, and I'm going to stop the recording now.